In this series of seminars, 4 speakers will take us on a journey through our inspirational values, which are courage, societal responsibility, integrity, and inclusion, to discuss how, by embracing them, we can create meaningful and lasting impact. The central theme connecting all the seminar is the role of human behavior in shaping specific action. And through an in-depth analysis of our values, we will explore how our choices in everyday life can translate IIT principle into concrete steps. The value we will examine are the beating heart of our organization. They guide our decision, our approach to scientific research, and the way we interact with the world. Together, we will discuss societal responsibility, because our research is a tool for growth and progress that aims to have a positive impact on society and the environment. We will talk about integrity, a fundamental pillar of every scientist's work. It is through moral and scientific integrity that we build trust both within and outside our institute. We will address the theme of inclusion, ensuring that the uniqueness of each person is welcome and recognized as a source of richness, a driving force for progress and creativity. We will talk about courage, because research is made of question, unexplored paths, and unexpected solutions. It is courage that drives us to pursue them with ambition and passion. I invite you to participate in this session with curiosity and openness, bringing your experiences, ideas, and questions. The first value we will explore today is courage, and guiding in this journey, there's Professor Immaculata De Vivo. Professor De Vivo did her PhD at Columbia University, her postdoc at Berkeley University and Stanford University, and then joined Harvard Medical School as a professor of medicine. She embodies courage in multiple ways. In her pioneering research on the intersection of emotion, spirituality, and longevity, topics often considered beyond the realm of traditional sciences, and in her ability to translate complex findings from academic papers into books accessible to the general public. She will also guide us in understanding courage from a biological perspective, shedding light on how it influences our choices and well-being. And with that, I'm honored to welcome Professor De Vivo to the stage.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. Thank you, Martina, and your whole team. I don't see Enrico, but thank you for the HR for inviting me here. I want to say to Marco, before I start, that in my lab, I've trained many, many people over the years, and nothing gives me great joy or success as the success in those that I've trained. And so I have not trained Marco, but if I have served as an inspiration, it is I who is proud and am honored. So today, I will talk about, I was asked to start the series with the first value, which is courage. And how does courage intersect with the series of books that I've written with my co-author, Daniel Lumera? And how does that, as Martina very well put, reflect some of the basic science research that I've done, both at Columbia, Berkeley, and then at Stanford for 5 long years, and mouse models to top it all, and then bring it to Harvard, where I have to say, since coming from 1998 in my lab, I've done only bench science, statistics, and genetics, and then I was able to somehow fold these into these sort of books that are, as Martina said, they're accessible to explain the science to the general public. Because at the end of the day, and this is something that I've discussed with another cousin of mine who's in the audience, is that at the end of the day, me and maybe Marco and other scientists in here and my colleagues, we already know the science or the data or the information. The point, if you really care to share it with the public towards understanding disease, towards public health, or curing or managing disease, you have to bring it out to the public. And so that was the goal of taking some of the research that I've done and bringing it, the accessibility is to let everyone understand what we do, so that it is to empower the lay public to know what is out there and what they can do within their control. So courage can be defined on an emotional level, on a physical level, and on a more moral level. So how do we get kindness and courage to interplay? It's pretty simple. You To be kind, it takes a lot of courage, right? It it's easy to react. It's very difficult to walk away or to manage a situation with compassion. But with that, I also want to talk about the science, the biology, because the uniqueness of the books, especially the first one, which is the biology of kindness, was the interplay between me and Daniel Lumera, a Buddhist monk who focused on the philosophy of values and the strategies and the sort of like the and the spirituality, for lack of a better word. And for me, as the scientist, to sort of bring in the biological handle to explain some of these pro-social behaviors that we're all familiar with. Okay, and so to give that biological handle is probably the best way you can express these the findings. So, how does courage manifest biologically? In a similar way that all these other pro-social behaviors manifest through the fight or flight pathway, which I will talk about. And the impact of the emotion, the hormones that are dysregulated, both in a positive way and in a negative way in the stress pathway. So I will go through the science through each chapter, so to speak, and each to introduce not just the main protagonist here, which are the telomeres, and how it interplays with the rest of the pro-social behaviors, but also ways in which you can build your resources to attain these attributes, these valori, as they say. So to start, I'm a big fangirl, as they say, of Charles Darwin. And I actually have another book series coming out, which is not to push to promote my books, but Path to Darwin. It's a whole the idea of how the history of science started with ancient philosophy and ended at Darwin. So this idea of evolution, and nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Okay, so the history of who we are is in our DNA. This is a metaphor that's used often when speaking about DNA, that everything has been written. You can know where you've been and where you're going. Okay, years of evolution, adaptation. So what has the greatest impact on your genes? The environment, right? Writ large, larger environment. Okay, and the process is ongoing. In that this metaphor that we've come up with, or this chapters take ages to be written, they would refer to the genes that don't change. For the most part, they're immutable, the genes, right? But some lines can be changed in a matter of years. This would be the epigenome. So there's the genome, which are the DNA letters that don't change or take, thousands of years to change, right, through mutation. But then you have the epigenome, right, which is where you don't actually change the letters, but you change the expression of the genes. It's modulated through methylation or telomeres, which I'll talk about. And that can happen within a lifetime. So that's the revolution. The revolution is that there are ways in which you can manage your health. Okay, so the story can still be modified. So what are these attributes or valori? Okay, you can't talk about the valori until we talk about the telomeres. So when I approach some of these research papers, and by the way, at the end of the talk every topic has at least 2 or 3 or 4 scientific papers that have been peer reviewed, such as PNAS, BMJ, they're all there. So for the ease of the slide on the eyes, I wanted to not fill it with footnotes with the bibliography. They're all available to you at the end of the talk. So when I was asked by scientists, psychiatrists, clinicians, social scientists, to work with them on these values, they would say to me, Ima, we study optimism, we study human behavior, we study all these pro-social behaviors, but it's very difficult to convince uh, the research to others because it's considered soft or maybe feelings. So is there a way we could put an objective measure that's reproducible, not just by you, but by many, right? So that, sort of like the scientific process. Uh, is there something we can do to measure the impact of these pro-social behaviors, not in the impact, let's say, of kindness or gratitude, but the general impact in your physiological impact? And I said, well, we do have telomeres, and I'll explain what those are. We can measure telomeres, which are a reflection of cellular health, and by extension, tissue health, and by extension, overall health, right? You build up. So, what are these telomeres? They are timekeepers, they're clocks, they're biological clocks. Every chromosome has ends to them, right? They have the centromere and then the two ends, the telomeres, which is that part of your chromosomes. That's all DNA. They're repetitive sequences, TTAGGG, that extend thousands of base pairs. And they're there to cushion the inside of your chromosome. Because the inside of your chromosome, that's where what we call the business end is. That's where your genes are. The genes that make albumin, the genes that make bilirubin, the genes that make. So you want to protect those because you don't want too much change in those, right? You want to be able to still make albumin without a problem. So we have, and it's evolutionarily conserved across all species, and you get some divergence in the very primitive species, like Paramecium. Slight changes in the DNA. So you have TTA, GGG, TTA, GGG. And so each chromosome, okay, if I'm the chromosome, my hands would be the telomeres. These bits of DNA, okay, in your somatic cells, what's a somatic cell? Heart cell, lung cell, anything but stem cells or germ cells. What's a germ cell? Sperm, ovaries, okay? They have, okay, so your telomeres are there to protect the chromosome because as they get shorter and shorter and shorter, it impacts the chromosome. The chromosome gets shorter and shorter, and there's a number at about 70 base pairs. It starts to turn in on itself and become unstable. And the best thing that can happen is that it induces apoptosis, which is cell death, and that cell dies. The worst thing that can happen is that it puts you at increased risk for cancer. And so that's how I got on to telomeres. At Stanford, I made mouse models of leukemia and fusion proteins, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things when you're studying cancer, you study immediately are telomeres and telomerase because they're in the cancer pathway. So 90% of all tumors overexpress telomerase. Telomerase is the enzyme that regulates telomere length. But telomerase, the enzyme, exists only in the germ cells and in the stem cells because the germ cells and your stem cells give rise to other cells. And you never want those cells to shorten and die off. You want to keep them very robust and healthy. Okay, but those are the stems. So the telomerase enzyme in the germ cells and stem cells are always on. The telomerase in your somatic cells, and this is work that we did with aborted fetuses early on, where we saw that telomerase is turned off about 15 weeks of gestation in your somatic cells because you don't need it anymore. The issue is that telomeres serve in cancer as tumor suppressors. So every time the cell divides, you run the risk of a mutation. The error rate is highest during DNA replication when the cell divides. So every time the cell divides, just statistically, you have a risk of having a mutation that may become cancerous in the off chance that telomerase is returned on. Remember, it's always in the off position in somatic cells. So you don't want upregulation of telomerase in a cell that's been around for a long time, divided a long time, picked up a lot of mutations because other steps have to happen, P53, et cetera, before it becomes cancerous. So the idea is that in somatic cells that are highly replicative, you don't want telomerase around. So because you don't have telomerase, telomeres get short. And it's important that they get short, okay? So the shortening is a sign of remember, it's a timekeeper of the cell. That's why it's called the biomarker or longevity. And the revolution with telomeres, and this is why I brought up the telomere with cancer, is because I always knew it from a cancer from a standpoint. The revolution is that the telomeres make up a robust way to measure epigenetic events. So epigenetic is above the DNA. There's no changes to the DNA, but the regulation, gene expression, okay, is impacted. So what's new in terms of the revolution is that non-genetic events, such as smoking, obesity, lack of physical activity, poor nutrition, pollution, and stress, impact telomere shortening. Through, in this particular case, what I'll talk about today, through the stress pathway, because it causes hyperproliferation of the cell, increased oxidative stress, increased inflammation. So it's a cycle. And these all impact hyperproliferation, oxidative stress, and inflammation, dysregulated, obviously, all impact the telomeres, making them shorter and shorter. So you say to me, oh, but Imma, you just said it's a normal process of a cell to have telomere shortening. Why do we care? We care from the standpoint from accelerated shortening. So the normal process is that as you age, the telomeres get shorter, but 25 base pairs, 50 base pairs a year. It's all known. Problem is, if you are shortening at 150 base pairs, 200 base pairs a year, what that does is bring on early onset of chronic disease. In other words, for this particular book, early onset of aging, early on, loss of your health span. Okay, I want to call it longevity, because in the end, it's not, there's no joy in living 150 years if you're broken, right? The idea is to have a really healthy lifespan while you're here. So that's the revolution. The revolution is that these important regulators, master regulators of your cell, okay, really important for cancer in particular, can now be influenced by non-genetic factors, such as, we call them the environment. Oxidative stress and inflammation and cellular, those are the three which I've talked about. That's how you shorten telomeres. Diabetes, cardiovascular disease, dementia, Alzheimer's are all impacted. So the idea is that if you can counter oxidative stress, you can counter inflammation through better nutrition, physical activity, lowering stress, a form of lowering stress through meditation, good sleep, and then, of course, these pro-social behaviors through kindness, optimism. You can do your part to maintaining the buffering, lowering the attrition. So stress, the invisible enemy. What is the fight or flight pathway? Has anybody ever heard of the fight or flight pathway? Of course. So we have two scenarios, acute versus chronic. You need the fight or flight pathway because it's your survival. It's an evolutionary adapted mechanism so that we don't even have to use ourselves. Let's use the lion or the giraffe on the savannah. The idea is that when you start the fight or flight in the acute phase, it's critical for survival. You have to outrun the predator. Okay. So what happens during fight or flight? First thing that happens is heart rate through the roof, sugar through the roof. You need glucose to fire off your big muscles, your thighs, because they're the ones that make you run. And so and then there's some suppression of your immune system. There's suppression of the systems that are energy expensive, biologically expensive at this, so that you can have all the means to run and survive another day. But that is meant to be acute, right? So that if you don't get eaten, you have more time to survive. The problem is when you turn that on chronically. Now, your body doesn't know whether you're running from the lion or sitting in the car in traffic. It doesn't know. The same systems. Heart rate goes up, glucose goes up, hormones are totally dysregulated and kept at suspended high levels, increased inflammation. How many people drove here today? How many people sat in traffic? How many people got upset? Did anybody check their heart rate? Check your heart rate. You can't sustain that. It's not meant for you to sustain. So chronic stress accelerates telomere attrition. There are many papers, not just by me, but by others, because if you do good science, you can't just rely on your own. You have to go to the community of scientists and see if they replicate it. And by the way, if you look at the UK Biobank, which is it's just the tour de force of what they've done. They've measured telomeres in the same way I measured telomeres on 500,000 people. And a lot of the results, the behavioral results, have held up. It's a UK Biobank. So these were papers that were published early on. Anyway, let's just not. Chronic stress, the stress pathway is implicated in these pro-social behaviors that I'll talk about, and that includes courage. Even though there's no paper or article on kindness, kindness is the sort of the catch-all for the pro-social behaviors, because there are papers, publications, PNAS papers on optimism and other forms of other types of pro-social behaviors. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, early adversity. This is a very famous paper on Romanian orphans that I had the privilege to work on. Has anybody here heard the story of the Romanian orphans? These, in 1989, when the Romanian government fell, it was found that babies, children, were kept in these institutions. And this is no exaggeration to say equivalent to a Holocaust kind of camp kind of situation, where the regime had asked the population to avoid birth control or abortion, because they said that the state would do a better job of raising children than them. And so they would give them the women incentives. And so the woman would have the baby and then bring the baby to the state, and the state would put him in the institutions. And so you don't have to listen to me. You could just Google the Romanian orphan experiment, and it was a natural experiment in disaster. And so those children were very, very damaged growing up, still to this day. And so at the Children's Hospital, they were called in 1989-90. Charles Nelson, who's a pediatrician, who went, they established these interventions where they took the children out of the camps, I call them camps, and put them in foster care. That was also quite a challenging times for these children. But in that paper, and we did all the telomere work, okay, and you say, from when? Well, they did have collected telomeres. They had blood samples and cheek cell samples where we looked at these children at 3 months, 9 months, 2 years, 3 years. And what we saw, and again, this is a completely other talk, because we've elucidated all the telomere dynamics in 1-year-old, 2-year-olds, and 3-year-olds with the Children's Hospital, but they were severely, let's go, short. And it was quite a paper. The paper, the publication ended up a lot of papers are often picked up by, the press. in the New York Times, for instance, the science section. This was picked up in the editorial section. And yeah, exactly. It was picked up in the editorial section by Nicholas Kristof, who said, social adversity, our social behavior impacts people at the DNA level. So it's not just emotional impact. We're seeing DNA damage that results in disease. So at that point, this was 2014, that paper came out. And this is not to sound like I had a burning bush moment, but I realized that a lot of this work that I'm doing now, in conjunction with my cancer work, has social impact. I need to do more of this because this is very satisfying, because we have always heard, oh, it's the stress. Stress will kill you. It's up here. It's up here. It's not just up here. It's in your DNA. And it makes a lot of damage. Again, you're sitting in the car for hours. Your heart rate is high. And when your heart rate is high and you get that stress pathway going, it's not just cortisol that's going up. Norepinephrine, adrenaline, your kidneys are everything, and it doesn't know. Are you running from the lion or are you sitting in your car? It doesn't know. The same physiological response will happen. So, as I said, I'm going to sprinkle questions after each little, if anybody would like to engage. Why are telomeres so revolutionary as a biomarker of aging? Anybody? Why are they so revolutionary? Because they're able to pick up damage that are non-genetic, that we thought never hurt us or never benefited us. So what is kindness? Again, there's no study on kindness because, as I've often been asked, why don't you study kindness? Well, how do you measure kindness? You can't just, you need a tool to measure the kindness, and then we could back it up with science, with an objective biomarker like this. But however, you can use it as a way to, like courage, you could use it as a way to catch other types of prosocial behaviors. So in that regard, kindness can be in the form of altruism, compassion, empathy, generosity, selflessness. So throughout these slides, I give you some real examples of how it's used in the clinic or in the lab. We know that there are studies that show that in particular, cancer hospitals, where the Dana-Farber, where I do a lot of my work, cancer treatment, by instituting protocol, which is always shocking to me that you have to introduce protocols on kindness, because you would think it's a natural reaction. But they already see better outcomes in their patients. How do you measure the outcomes? You measure it through response to treatment. And all of the prosocial behaviors that are included in today's lecture, which are in the book, are not to say that one should replace traditional therapy or treatment for a particular, it's what you can do in addition to. So what it does, like a lot of these prosocial behaviors, and we know this through this field of study called positive psychology, it lowers stress levels. It lowers hormone levels. It lowers, many of these studies have brain scans. So they're parts of your brain, the amygdala. People have heard the amygdala is your alarm system, right? When you get very stressed, your amygdala gets very enlarged, and it's part of the stress pathway. So there are other indices that support each other. So we know that kindness can prevent cardiovascular disease. It lowers hypertension. There's different types of hypertension, I'm aware, but when you have such a high heart rate as a result of the stress, you can only imagine that over time there's a lot of damage accrued. Phobic anxiety was another psychiatric disorder that I was privileged to be part of. I have a paper on phobic anxiety, and the people who are highly phobic, it's not anxiety, it's a type of phobic anxiety. It's usually diagnosed. This might interest you for those working on autism. It's sort of in the realm of being diagnosed in children early on, and it's chronic. And so if you have a chronic disease, it's amenable to studying telomeres, because the changes that you see in telomeres, it's multiplicative. It's not just one point in time. it's not like a cholesterol level where it's impacted immediately by the meal you've eaten. It takes time because depending on the age of the cell, like a red blood cell has an age of 120 days, meaning the replication, you won't see it. So it all depends. But phobic anxiety was very interesting because these are children who are diagnosed at about 10 or so, and it's lifelong. Okay, depression is even different because depending on the type of depression, it's episodic. It's hard to capture the impact of depression with a telomere measurement because it's not chronic. But phobic anxiety is described as having fear of elevators or rumination, intrusive thoughts. So they're wearing down their DNA. And that was reflected in the telomere measurement because those who had the highest score on phobic anxiety. So you work with psychiatrists on this. They also had the shortest telomeres, and the paper has been published in a peer-reviewed article, and so it's available to you. So how does kindness affect our health and longevity? That's something you can think about. You can even ask me at the end for the process of not going too long today. Optimism. So what is optimism? Is optimism being happy all the time? Is it? It's not. Optimism is your worldview. So you could have a bad day, a bad week, even a bad month, and say, but you know what? Tomorrow is going to be better. Eventually, things will work out. That's the difference of an optimistic viewpoint versus a pessimistic viewpoint. Again, mediated through the stress pathway, fight or flight. It can be scientifically measured across surveys. This is the life orientation test. So Martin Selig at UPenn is the father of positive psychology. He created all these questionnaire instruments to measure optimism, and is a very famous PNAS paper, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science paper that we're on, that shows that people who are optimistic live longer. And then the way I come in is sort of, oh, we found this result with healthy aging and longevity. Can you see if the telomeres were impacted? So yeah, and if they have blood or some sort of DNA that I can use, then we can measure that. So I want to just give you my favorite, one of my favorite chapters is the optimism chapter, in part by this particular experiment that was run. The swimmer's experiment goes like this. This is what these kind of scientists do, right? So there were a college team of swimmers, and they were told that to qualify for the championships, they had a certain time to reach. So they had them race the race, and then what they did was they were sort of a little bit deceptive with their times, not enough to make them know that they were being studied, but just off by a little bit. So they told them, these are your times. Okay, you have to better these times in order to make the championships. So what did they find out? That at the end, there was a group of swimmers that indeed bettered their time. But then there was a group of swimmers that actually did worse. So some people are given bad news and do better. And some people actually do worse. And so the optimist uses all their reserves to do better. The pessimist was like, well, why should I even try? I'm never going to make it. That is one of the best experiments in the book for me. So optimism is biologically relevant. So there are two ways in which optimism impacts your health: direct and indirect. Direct in that it lowers your stress response. Indirect is that what we notice is optimistic people have better lifestyle. They eat better. They exercise more. They're more normal weight. They tend to go get their medical checkups. They tend to go to the dentist. They tend to have healthier lifestyle. Optimists invest in their health. So there's two ways: indirect and direct. That's how optimism improves longevity, and lowers mortality. We know this is why I was brought on. Hey, Ima, there's a 25%, maybe, più o meno, 25% genetic component to optimism. But I would say, well, there's only 25%. You still have 75% chance of improving it. And there are ways in which you can improve your optimism. So it's not a fait complete. It's not something that is written in stone. Remember, this is ways in which you can improve. And in the book, there are ways in which you can do it. But if there's time in the Q&A, I'm happy to share with you what I learned from the optimist experts. You know, I'm intellectually promiscuous, so I love working with all these different scientists. I learned so much. So how is optimism biologically relevant? It's not a test, but works in two ways. Directly on your stress pathway, lower the heart rate, bring everything back to baseline, as well as people are optimistic, care, invest more in their health. They're generally healthier. That's in the PNAS paper. Oh, this is a great chapter. So this is a great chapter that Daniel and I really had a good time with, because I actually learned a lot from him. But I won't talk too much about some of the parables, for lack of a better word, that he shared with us. But here again, it lowers anxiety, depression, hostility, addiction. This is where courage comes in. It's easier to be angry and to hold a grudge, right? And to feel the victim all the time. But it's hurting your health to do that. So when you forgive someone, you're not doing anything for the other person. You're forgiving yourself by unloading the grudge. You're freeing yourself. Oh, I'm never going to forgive that person because they slighted me 20 years ago. Never going to talk to them. Who are you hurting? That person 20 years ago doesn't even probably even remember. You're hurting yourself. So this idea that forgiveness is something that you have a lot of control. Okay, it's liberating. It's the grudge that wears down. It keeps the stress pathway activated, which increases inflammation, which increases cellular proliferation. Your foot is on the pedal all the time, and the cells don't like that. And once all your cells start collapsing, the tissues start collapsing. And what is old age? Pancreas runs out, kidneys stop working. So one of the ways in which we tested measured forgiveness and impact was through veterans, through PTSD. So the military, not surprisingly, suffer from post-traumatic stress disease syndrome. Everyone know PTSD is your mind can't forget what your eyes have seen. So it's constant. It's on the movie in your head. So the military, I've worked with the VA on this paper, the Boston veterans, and these are people, men and women that are trained to be, machines of war, and so they have seen very horrible things, and they've done very horrible things because this is what you do, and so they come back incredibly damaged, and the PTSD is violent not only to themselves often but to others. And so there are ways in which Harvard, for instance, has a Center for Forgiveness, where it's not church. It is where you go and you learn some of the ways in which you can get rid of the grudge. It's beyond therapy. It's actually, because it's such a huge public health problem, PTSD. Okay, there are ways in which you can manage this through professionals. And then I also looked at the civilian women, meaning the nurses' health in the nurses' health study. We had many women who had, who had PTSD as a result of violence, both sexual and domestic, and they were also in papers. And what a way in which they can release forgiveness is through self-compassion. So what impact does forgiveness have on the psychological health? And in this way, the hard outcome is PTSD, and it does lower it does lower the symptoms associated with a PTSD, the constant rumination, the grudge. Happiness. Now this is different. Happiness is happiness. Can we really measure happiness? Well, the Framingham Heart Study did. So the Framingham Heart Study, which is in Framingham, Massachusetts, it is famous for really one thing in the general public, telling us that cholesterol is important for cardiovascular disease. That's the Framingham Heart Study. That's what they told us, okay? Many years ago, 50, 60 years ago, but it's still ongoing. And so two investigators, one of whom I know, showed in a paper that you can actually measure happiness, and it's contagious. And in the paper, which is referenced, it goes out about 1 mile, or I speak in non, well, I have to give you the paper. The US is miles, not the metric system. So it's 1 mile or 2 mile or 3 miles. The further out you go, the less happy you are in relation to someone who's happy. So it's like anything else, it's contagious. So we all know this. If your friends like to have a glass of wine, you will like to have a glass of wine. So this idea of the contagion is, but what's interesting about this is that it can be measured collectively, and it spreads through networks. And that's part of the paper. It's a really great neural networks, machine learning type of way to measure this. And so the paper quotes that you can lower mortality by about 14%. The difference between happy versus unhappy. Purpose in life cannot be underestimated. You have a reason to get up out of bed every day, whatever that is. It will go a long way to keep your telomeres strong, healthy, and general health and longevity. Purpose is incredibly important. So, how is happiness contagious? Well, if you're happy, a lot of people close to you be happy. And also the converse is also true, but we're not going to talk about that because we want to be happy right now. So how is happiness linked with health and illness? It's, again, stress pathway. So then we develop these strategies, ways in which you can help yourself gain optimism, gain gratitude, having the ability to let go of the grudge by being kind to yourself. Kind, again, catch all. Ways in which you can get your resources up to the point where you can become more courageous, more compassionate, more forgiving, more kind. Relationships. Now, in Italy, this may not be a problem, but it's a huge problem in the United States. Loneliness or lack of social connections. And so relationships protect from chronic disease, memory, even at old age. And my colleague Bob Waldinger has studied a very famous Harvard study for about 80, 90 years where they followed them over time. JFK was one of the students because they were Harvard students in this early on in the 40s. And what they found after following people for 80 years and looking at socioeconomic status and looking at education and looking at wealth and looking at that, the number one predictor of healthy aging was social relationships. Social relationships were, but not toxic or ones that have conflict, but nurturing social relations. So lack of social relationships can increase early deaths by 50%. Now, these numbers are not made up. All the papers are in the bibliography. Regardless of other factors such as age, sex, and overall health, that refers to the long-lived study performed by Bob Waldinger. It's this, when we publish our papers, we've always asked by the publishers, by the editors, to put a translational piece. And so it's comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. This idea of social isolation. It's worse than being obese or sedentary. It's really bad. It protects you against cardiovascular events. It lowers mortality. It helps recovery. And I did in a breast cancer paper that we did in a nurse's health study. Um, we saw a huge impact, whether if the women were getting themselves to treatment alone, whether they had no family, no one to take care of them during breast cancer treatment, it was 50%. 50%. So a lot of these prosocial behaviors that I studied are in relation to cancer, cardiovascular disease to a lesser extent, but because my expertise is in cancer, that's why a lot of the results are focused on cancer. And I was briefly mentioning that not all cancer is the same. Okay, so we look at these cancers as a composite disease, but they're not all the same. The more aggressive types, like breast cancer, is at least 10 different cancers, and it's all grouped under breast cancer. And that's okay for just speed of discussion, but given their molecular signatures at the DNA level, there are 10 different cancers, which impacts the way they're treated. So what are the effects of the quality of relationships? Have relationships, but not ones with conflict. Get rid of the conflict and bring in the healthy relationships. Nutrition. This everyone knows, this Mediterranean diet. People say, what's the Mediterranean diet? It's the diet that's associated with the Cilento region or the Campania region of Italy. It is heavy on fruits and vegetables and legumes and very little meat, fish. The point is that it's filled with foods that are high in anti-inflammatory and oxidative stress factors. And we did a study in a nurse's health study where we looked at 4,000 women that either consumed foods on the Mediterranean diet or the Western diet. We looked at 4 different diet patterns, and we found that women who adhere to a Mediterranean diet, and we use the quantitative scale on the Mediterranean diet, it corresponds, every point changes. The 9 points is the highest you can get, but it corresponded to adding a year and a half of life to you by just switching, just by eating better. And there's the science. So we measured it through telomeres. So we looked at the objective measure here. How do we measure the impact? So you can, of course, use other measures, cholesterol level, but that's not that great. Other serum levels, but they're transient. They're turned over with whatever you eat the night before, the coffee, whatever. But your DNA doesn't change. So telomeres is something once they get short, you cannot elongate them. But what you can do is you can keep them from getting shorter. So you can buffer. Okay, so these strategies are ways in which you can buffer. So you want to get back to normal shortening, not accelerated shortening. Improves cognitive skills. All right, this is a paper in BMJ that I published. It buffers aging. We looked at all of these indices. It lowers depression because many papers came out of that paper. Long-term weight loss, we know this. And more importantly, it improves sleep. Again, also correlated with better health. Obesity is about 30% genetics, but it's multifactorial. So there's many ways in which you can confront this public health problem. So what is the Mediterranean diet and its effects? Those are the ones we just went through. Physical activity, the best predictor of early aging. So just as an aside, I worked with the National Football League, the NFL, the American football, the aggressive one, right? And there was a study, which, by the way, was because they didn't like the results that we were saying, was unfunded anymore. But anyway, we worked with the NFL and the National Football League, and what we the results were remarkable, and they're not published, so there's nothing for me to. But over and over and over again, the emphasis on physical activity, the best predictor of healthy aging. stayed off frailty, stayed off strength, just getting up and out of the chair, right? Many old people, they could be, 50, 25 kilos, but they can't get themselves out of the chair. So I can't emphasize enough, okay, the benefits of physical activity. And we did a paper in the Nurses Health Study. We saw a huge impact. So it's sort of like the science, the objective science matches the other data points, which is just 20 minutes a day of vigorous activity. You don't have to run. These are nurses. These are not Olympic athletes. These are just nurses that did vigorous walking or light jogging 3 or 4 times a week. And we saw a gain of 4.4 years by their telomere measurement. So we looked at women who were not active or different activity levels. And those that I just said, vigorous exercise, meaning vigorous walking or jogging, light jogging, you can have a profound effect on your aging. Again, the difference between smoking and non-smoking. So we know for cardiovascular, 30-40% reduces the risk by 30-40%, and you don't have to run. Diabetes, this has been known for so long that you can lower your diabetes risk or the impacts of diabetes just walking 20 minutes a day. Lowers it by 40%. And also, you can't underestimate the impact of physical activity on your sleep. It's just unmistakable. So what are the benefits of physical activity, and how does physical activity sleep? Well, there in many ways. So here, physical activity doesn't necessarily work through the stress pathway, even though it does, but it works on all other physiological muscles. It modulates your glucose levels so you don't have the spikes. Cardiovascular, it builds stronger muscles. So it is the best predictor to be physically active for healthy aging. Meditation. So this is the other one that was the initial connection between me and Daniel Lumera at a meeting in Milan in 2019. So meditation is a way to reduce stress. And there are different types of meditation. I'm not here to promote any kind of meditation other than to say sitting quietly for even 10 minutes a day can do a lot to lower cortisol, norepinephrine. So it reduces stress. So I had the privilege of working with Elizabeth Hoagie, who's a psychiatrist in the Mass General Hospital, who studies women with depression. She's a clinical psychiatrist. So she was treating women with depression and noticed that the women that she saw as clinicians and scientists, we're nothing but observers. We observe and we collect data. What she noticed that the women who responded the best to depression from drugs and therapy were the women that also did some form of meditation or yoga. So she came to me, and she also studied for 8 years in India. Her voice alone just calms you right down. She came to me and she said, I noticed this, and I hear you have this objective marker, something that actually can measure irreversible damage to your DNA. I said, yeah, we could measure the telomeres because it's a marker of, that's immune, once you damage it. She goes, let's look at that. So she was studying so the women in her study were practicing a particular type of meditation called loving kindness meditation. What this is a type of meditation where you have compassion, self-compassion, where you work through this cycle of 10 minutes of these kind intentions, and you offer compassion not just to yourself but others. So again, it works to sort of get rid of the grudge, get rid of the stresses. So we did a study, and there's a paper with the title Love and Kindness Meditation and Telomeres, and it's just not the telomeres that we measured. There's also brain scans. Okay, so there's a lot of objective data in this paper to reinforce this idea that by quieting the mind through this technique, you're able to achieve this lower stress level. Okay, and the way they defined long-term meditators were they had to meditate for about 4 years compared to women didn't do anything at all, not even yoga. So there was a control group. And so that's what's in that paper. And so um, even a few minutes a day can protect your memory, um, your immune system. I mean, these are papers. There's now about, if you do a Google search, a PubMed search, thousands of papers on this. So much so that Mount Sinai Hospital in LA, their cancer center, has built meditation centers. MGH, there's a pain clinic that has, the last talk I gave before I literally got on the plane Friday night was Friday morning to MGH, the pain center. They have meditation facilitators or teaching as a way to help. And it's quite impressive. So it's not just sentiments or feelings, or these are actual concrete ways in which hospitals, clinics, institutions are implementing these pro-social behaviors because they have such a, objective way to measure their positive impact on health. They're using all of this. So we know for cancer, because I've given talks at these centers, and we know the impacts on the brain because there are scans. There's also a very famous friend I have, Sarah Lazar, who was the anti-believer in all this woo-woo stuff, she said, until it happened to her. Then she changed her whole PhD to study things like this. She's also in the book, but you could do a quick search. It's quite impressive. So she does all of this brain imaging with mindfulness and meditation. So how do you get a state of meditation? Why is it important? Thousands of papers are out there to support this. Music. This was a fun chapter. I don't have any expertise, or no way have we measured it, but I worked with my neighbor who is world famous neuroscientist. He's also a clinician who is very famous for using music on the brain to help stroke patients. You can look him up, Gottfried Schlag. But he and I, we sort of had a talk, and I said, "You think it's worth including in the book?" And of course, he says, absolutely, because music lowers stress, blood pressure, heart rate, cortisol, and inflammation. I said, these are all the things you need to keep your telomeres healthy as well. And it turns out that there are different classic musicians, Mozart versus Beethoven, it's in the chapter, depending on the measure of which music they're playing, has direct impact on blood pressure, good and bad. So those are the physiological responses. So music therapy, we know, is used now for children with autism. This is not any, but now it's not just feeling good. There are actual changes, not just in the brain, but also in the blood and at the DNA level. That's how it's used as a therapeutic tool. Nature. Everyone know Oliver Sacks? Anyone ever heard of Oliver Sacks, the neuroscientist? The Awakenings with Robert De Niro, the movie? There you go, okay. So those were those patients that had these really incredibly they call it neurodivergent, neurological diseases. I remember seeing him when I was at Columbia. He would take his patients to the botanical garden as a way to treat them. And he was a clinician. And he has a lot of famous books. The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, because these are the kind of patients he worked with. And the point is, I was so inspired by that happened to me 30 years ago, that I knew we had to include nature as part of the wellness, so to speak. So we know, and we've done studies. Francine Layden in the Nurses Health Study has led these studies, and they look at green space and how it impacts mortality. How do we look at green space? Very fancy satellites, GIS, spatial, it's all done very objectively. And then they come to me, they say, we see this association. Can you give us the biological handle? Can we measure the telomeres? Because we're seeing something. And so, yes, it lowers depression, increases vitamin D. So here too, nature works two ways, direct and indirect. Direct, because if you are exposed to nice areas to walk, green spaces, you're more likely to be physically active, you're more likely to eat better. All the better lifestyle are all correlated. And of course, vitamin D production, which is important, and indirect by the stress release of being outside in nature. So we know that telomeres, longer telomeres in green spaces, shorter in urbanized places, but not to say that urbanized places don't have green spaces. New York City, for instance, has this Central Park. So don't be discouraged if you live in a city, because there are always ways in which, and the cities are becoming greener and greener. And again, these papers don't have blood DNA measurements. They also have other objective markers, brain scan, cognitive surveys. And of course, we also saw childhood impacts. And again, how does it improve our well-being? So how do we conclude this talk? The way we started, with kindness and courage. So kindness may seem gentle and positive, and courage appears bold and assertive. Kindness often requires an immense amount of courage. It takes courage to be kind. It takes courage to walk away from a conflict. And when you're walking away from the conflict, remember what's going on in your brain. Whoop, heart rate, glucose. Whoop. Your body doesn't know if you're running away from the lion or just having an argument with a coworker. Same reaction. And so kindness, the act of being considerate and compassionate towards others, yet being kind in a world that frequently celebrates self-interest and competition, sometimes demands bravery, which is the courage. It takes courage to extend kindness to those who may not reciprocate it, even harder to do, to offer understanding in moments of conflict, and to remain gentle in the face of aggression. The courage amplifies kindness, enabling to transcend more sensitive and become a force of change. And I can continue to read this, but there are two sides of the same coin. Kindness within courage transforms acts into catalysts for social good, ensuring that they're aimed at uplifting rather than tearing down. Together, kindness and courage empower individuals to stand up against injustice, to speak truth, and to be uncomfortable, and to create spaces for empathy. And empathy is absolutely one of the, if people lack empathy, we are in trouble. There's no humanity if you don't have empathy. The synergy between kindness and courage can be transformative. And it's also good for your health. So one of my favorite quotes when Martina asked me to work in courage and kindness is by Maya Angelou. It takes courage to be kind. Being kind requires us to be courageous, and that true courage often manifests itself through acts of kindness. Thank you for your kind attention.
So thank you, Professor De Vivo, for your words. I think that, every one of us can resonate with it. And well, I was at a meditation workshop last weekend, and actually, the speaker, the person who introduced this workshop, actually said something that really resonated with me, and that you mentioned. And it was a kind of a quote from an American poet. Was saying, "Be kind with the past version of yourself, because they didn't know what you now know." And I think that that really is connected with what you said about kindness and forgiveness, of course. I would like to ask the audience if there are any questions. Okay, my colleague will handle you the microphone.
I understand this is a general talk, but if there are any questions related to the details of the science, and if there's time, I could take them now or after. Yes.
Hello. Yeah, very nice. A lot of questions. I will pick up two. The first question is, do you know if related to anxiety and mood, if anti-anxiety medication and mood stabilizer, if they have an effect and an impact on telomeres and the other stressor? And in case they do you think it would be possible to use this medication together with anti-cancer therapy?
That's a great question, and a question I'm often asked about these, but that would require intervention trials. A lot of this work was cross-sectional. The closest we come is probably, and I don't want to speculate, here's the issue, and this brings in some science that I have to talk about. So telomeres, like I said, telomerase is turned off very early on in somatic cells. And so when babies are born, female babies have longer telomeres than male babies, about 150 base pairs. That's just the way it is, right? And so that difference is kept throughout life. But what we study, the dynamics that we've learned is that babies lose the most telomeres the first 3 years of life. And then you have a linear relationship with telomere length and age up until the year of 20. Why is this important? I'll tell you. So it's linear. So the more because it's related to cell proliferation, right? So at about 20, what happens is it's no longer linear, the relationship with age and telomere. It sort of slowly plateaus. And so the differences, become, the deltas become less and less. And so a lot of these studies, with the exception of the Romanian orphans, were in adults, where the differences are hard to capture with an assay like this, because when you're in your middle ages, you have to wait a long time to see the difference, is what I'm saying. You'd have to wait 5 or 10 years to know. So going back to your question, an anti-anxiety medication, you have to do an intervention trial, and you'd have to look at over time what happens. The reason I gave you all that biology is to have you understand it's because of the dynamics of telomeres themselves. It's a self-limitation, and to answer that question, yeah.
So related but more provocative. So in a way, we know that natural compounds,
yeah,
nutraceuticals, they can help because they can do something, and moreover, the perception of the society is that we can take few is natural, so we can start taking it when we are kids and takes for our life. Do you think it's possible that the same logic can be applied, low doses obviously, but can be applied with drugs, not natural compounds? So do you advise that it would be possible that, for example, I take low level of anti-anxiety drugs or anti-cholesterol drugs, but for all my life to be protected? Is this something that makes sense, or is too much because you cannot drug a person for all his life?
You want opinion or science?
Both of them.
Okay, so the disclaimer is I'm not a clinician, and that's how we all get out of it, right? But I don't, well, every drug has a side effect. Every drug. I don't know of any drugs that have no side effect, unless I can be schooled right now. You can tell me that. But over time, over time, even at a low dose, you build up a concentration. My personal rule is, just from the literature that I know, is that if you are deficient, and this, I've done work with vitamin D at all levels, okay, at the DNA level, epigenetic level, gene expression level, polymer. If you are deficient in something like vitamin D, then the vitamin D supplements are recommended, right? And that usually happens with older age because absorption and et cetera, et cetera. But if there's no deficiency, at least in the United States of America, I don't know if you are properly eating, you're over neutralized because everything is fortified. All the food is fortified. So I can't speak to taking low doses of anti-anxiety because I'm not a clinician, but my opinion is that every drug, every pharmaceutical would have a side effect. If you don't need it, why would you be taking it? In anticipation of something may happen is probably not a good, I don't think it's a good enough reason.
So I have a couple of questions as well. Shall I go, Marco? Do you want to? So I'm an engineer, and this question may be obvious for those of you who are biologists, but like, what I knew about the human body is that like we have a constant turnover of cells. So different types of cells die and grow at different rates. But what I sort of remember from high school science is that like I'm not myself. Like in 6 months from now, the parts that make up my body will be different from the ones that make it up now. And so if the cells constantly grow and die, how do you measure telomere length if there's a constant turnover of cells? So this is...
That's a great question. And you know, you're alluding to that famous Greek, if you rebuild a ship, if you rebuild every plank on a ship, is it the same ship? That's a philosophical. Oh, that's a philosophical question, but I'm glad you asked that because like I was telling Marco, I don't want to overload them with science, but if the questions come up. So stem cells, they come out of the bone marrow. So aging is essentially a depletion, bone marrow depletion. Over time, you are honed, your bone marrow, your stem cells are pretty much honed for your life. Okay, so senescence, which is basically cells going to sleep. So your there's stem cell depletion and hematopoietic stem cells like white blood cells, immune cells. So what you're seeing is if you have rapid turnover and you're losing cells more quickly, your bone marrow has to pump out more stem cells because you do have a reserve, but the reserve can run out sooner for some than others. So yeah, you are looking at germline also. So you have your germline DNA is what you're born with. I'm not looking at somatic. I'm looking at constitutional DNA, what you were born with. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, like I thought you took out cells from people and then you measured with a sort of small ruler the telomere length.
No, it's not like that. But I could tell you how we do it. But yes, but the point is you're absolutely right. So you get new cells. Now, some cells hardly ever replicate, right? Muscle cells are slow, neuron cells are slow. Red blood cells have 120 days. So all these cellular compartments are honed. So when you deplete all your reserves, that's aging. Your immune system slows down, everything slows down. Yeah.
Can I go? Okay. Here I am.
Yep.
Okay. First of all, thank you. The talk was amazing. I think very inspiring, and I can, let's say, find all my life in what you said. By chance, I was actually a professional swimmer, so you taught me somehow. And actually, I just for share with everyone. I mean, I think it can be interesting. I experienced everything. I was like, training, but I had like mental coach, nutritionist, yoga teacher, and all these things that push you to perform. Okay. Also, this term, I think it's like kind of rapid in our society because they ask you to perform in terms of, numbers. While I believe that performing means being healthy. Healthy means I rest so I can perform. I eat well so I can perform. And I have a couple of questions coming from my experience. Would be like, first of all, if you think that, because when I was like, learning how to manage anxiety, depression, because when you need to race, you need to be, not only your body, but your mental health should be totally okay. And my yoga teacher was like explaining us, we were child, 15, 16, whatever, that the most important thing is visualizing, It was like, okay, imagine yourself be on the track, ready to start the race. You feel the same anxiety, like, oh my gosh, I'm shaking, I am blocking and whatever. And this exercise of visualizing was helping us to reduce everything. I was like training the stress somehow. And I was wondering if you think that this can be a key point, connecting everything that you shared, like, nutrition, stress, work, and whatever you had explained us. First question.
So this idea of visualization and manifesting, I think that was really covered by Daniel, because I don't have the expertise to talk about that, but I can tell you that the good nutrition, the meditation, and actually your swimming, these are all ways in which you are bettering the health of your body, keeping your cells healthy, your tissues healthy. They all work together. Of course, they're all correlated. And so is there any specific one over the other that's better or worse? Hard to say, because all of these are like, in your experience, it was all correlated. I can't speak to the visualization. I could tell you that the impact on the biological level, but but I know Daniel has writes about that in terms of like visualizing your.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because I believe, I mean, most of this problem that you are like, people don't really understand that they are like sitting in the car and they are like stressing, and maybe they don't really visualize what is going on. This was the more or less.
That's my example. That's what I always say. Your body doesn't know whether you're running from the lion or sitting in the car. It doesn't know, but the same systems. Your stem cells are going to pump out more cells, and every time you pump out more cells, you're depleting the reserves. Those reserves are supposed to last a long time.
Yeah. So, two last questions. So, in the end, why society is actually pushing us to do actually the opposite, to fight every time, to perform in this way? What is your opinion about this? Why we are pushing all of us without kind of any reason?
Someone can ask you to fight, but you don't have to. You have agency to say, no, that's not how I see it, or that's not how I want to approach it. You have agency, control, or whatever the word is. I don't like to use control sometimes because it has a negative effect on, control. But you have agency to know what you should do and not do.
Last question. Yep. Then I stop right there. In your experience, do you never see like, because you spoke about the fact that we can like kind of slow down, or let's say control the quantity of telomerase that we destroyed and whatever. Okay. So you spoke about like 200 for a year and whatever, while the average is like 50 or whatever. Do you never see people that were able to reduce these numbers? So I can even go over not only controlling, but maybe reduce totally the number of these damages somehow.
Great question. So I have studies on centenarians. They have centenarians that live over 100, where I have samples from Okinawa, parts of Sicily. So the average, it's telomere length, about 25 base pairs, normal, right? And again, cell to cell, it varies a little bit. They go at 6. So they have actually shortened. That's why they're living longer. They average attrition rate is about 6 base pairs per year, compared to 25, compared to people who have early onset diseases that up to 200. So there is a range. You're welcome.
May I go? So again, thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Extremely, extremely interesting and inspiring.
The questions make it, excuse me, the questions get me to say more. I'm moderating a session, a symposium next week on women's health. So I told my speakers, you only have 20 minutes, but we have a Q&A. So send me questions you want me to ask you that you can't address while you're talking, because that's when all the information comes out too.
In one of your first, I think was the third or the fourth slide, you have a bullet point on having more time. It was related to stress, having more time since I'm close to retirement. So that is interesting for me. So I missed, if you spoke about it, I missed it. Can you go back to that point?
Speak about it, because I just had it on the slide. Okay. Robert Sapolsky. Has anybody ever heard of Robert Sapolsky? So Robert Sapolsky, another big fan of mine. I read all his books. Sapolsky was an animal geneticist at Stanford. He studied, if I remember right, I forget if it was chimpanzees. He studied primates, let's go with that, for 30 years. And he has very famous books like Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Has anybody ever heard of Why Zebras? So he essentially, he studies animals, and he gave, and his whole research was fight or flight, the stress pathway. Okay. And his mentor was, he passed away recently at Rockefeller. Essentially, these two told us everything we know how stress is related to disease and chronic disease. So what he noticed, living in Africa, every summer he would go with his wife, who was also a researcher with him, is that when the chimpanzees or whatever the primates were, they had about 2 hours of work every day, whether it was going to get food or grooming. But then the rest of the day, they had nothing to do. And so what he noticed is that during this downtime is when they would fight and cause havoc and cause problems. So he concluded that having too much free time causes this stress in primates, and by extension must be in humans. So this is related to when people are bored. I don't know, from personal experience, if you notice someone just out of the blue brings up an irritating topic, and my response is, are you bored? You have nothing to do? Because I got so much, I can't, that happened 5 years ago. So this idea that this is not my idea, it's Robert Sapolsky. If you look it up, Google search Robert Sapolsky, chimpanzees and time and stress, that if you have too much unproductive or purposeful time, you tend to engage in these kind of conflicts. At least this is what he noticed in the chimpanzees. And when I mean purpose, just because you're retired or transitioning to another phase in your life, doesn't mean you don't have a purpose, right? I mean, it could be anything. So don't concern yourself with retiring. Embrace it. Any other questions?
May I, Professor?
Oh, please.
Thank you so much, first of all. I would like to go through the concept of courage and trauma.
Oh.
And in particular, is it something that courage is something that we can learn maybe after a trauma, or something that trauma can trigger in some way? Or is it something that we have always inside us? I mean, can a trauma trigger the courage or the optimistic way to live?
So that's a great question as well, because what I've learned from working with very good psychiatrists, psychologists, social scientists, is that all of these pro-social behaviors, is what they call them, can be learned. They can all be learned. Even if they say, oh, born a pessimist, don't believe that, because all of this can be learned. And some ways in which they can be learned is through cognitive behavioral therapy, through acts of volunteering, acts of journaling. There are ways in which you can, yes, part of what I've learned with working with them, and again, I speak on their behalf because I'm not expert in that. I'm just a lab scientist. What I've learned is that you have to process all of these, I've learned there's trauma with a big T, and then there's trauma with a small t. And then there's just normal disappointments and challenges that happen and that are part of just life that don't have a diagnosis. Oftentimes what I hear from them is that so many people feel victimized or oppressed by feeling sad, or and they say there's some range at which everybody feels all of these emotions, and it's normal. One of the things I learned from a very interesting psychiatrist who said, in terms of this, like telling people their stuff, of course, if there's something that needs to be addressed, if you tell a child there's something wrong with them, they will start to believe there's something wrong with them. So, there's a fine balance with that. And so, yes, my understanding, and people do it, and I do it. You can assume a lot of these strategies and ways in which you can process trauma to work on forgiveness, work on bringing all of these optimism. There's a whole, you don't have to buy the book, obviously. This is not what this is about. But there's, if you even look online with Martin Selig and my collaborators at Harvard, there's an optimism site where the things that you can do to become more optimistic. Journaling is a very important. And there's another thing that I actually, when I wrote the paper, I tried it on my daughter. You go home and I learned a lot from these papers. So you go home and you ask your kid or your spouse or whoever you're with, friend, what are you grateful for? But it can't be open-ended like that. Give me 3 things that you're grateful for. And of course, my kid would say, nothing went well today. I said, you can't name 3 things that you're grateful for today? Like, did you eat something that made you grateful? Or she goes, oh, well, I ate this, and that was 1. And then, I got to see my friend that's 2. And then I go, come on, there's 3 things. It could be anything. It doesn't have to be winning the lottery, right? It could be, she goes, oh, and then I got invited to a party. So I learned this stuff working with these people, and then I would go home and actually try to implement. So there were ways, great gratitude journals is what they call them. So at the end of the day, at your nightstand, you say, for instance, tonight, number 1, I'm grateful for having been invited here and giving you this talk. Number 2, I anticipate a nice walk after all this. And number 3, a nice dinner tonight. So, I'm hoping that maybe things will change when I go to bed. Maybe there'll be other things that I'm grateful for. But it's that simple. Don't complicate it, people. It's not that complicated. Anyway. Yes.
Hello.
Yes.
First, I want to thank you for the great. Everything was perfect. Thank you so much. And I just want to know that there are some countries in the world that they're struggling with different aspects like economic crisis or poverty or anything that maybe some other people cannot imagine. And these aspects of being in a healthy life, like such as avoiding stress or being optimist or something like this, are I think there are more they're happening in rich and wealthy societies. And what about those people who are struggling with this problems? It's so hard to define them. Please be optimistic, or please listen to music or do meditation. They're fighting for food and stuff like this. I mean, it's very hard to define. These things are beautiful and also they're. I mean, it's obvious, but it's obvious for us, which maybe we are not struggling with this things that I said, and how we can help those guys, those countries, those people to being more optimistic or trying to reduce their stresses. It's very big question for me. If I see someone or family, how can I talk about your presentation to them? If he or she or that family are hungry, and these things, I think they're pointless for them. I don't know how to say that.
No, and it's hard. I agree. It's hard to feel optimistic when everything around you is not. And this is where the empathy comes in. I have great empathy, almost too much sometimes, but I have great empathy for people who are suffering like that. I wish there was more empathy worldwide to help. All I can share with you are some of the stories that I've heard in my experiences with some Holocaust survivors that have lost. These are people who have lost everything and were smuggled into the United States with nothing, literally nothing, and they had nothing. And when we ask, because we have a lot of programs, of course, and we ask, how did you get through this? Again, this is not to appease or to take away any of the suffering that you mentioned, because I really don't have an answer for that other than what I can share with you from what I heard from others who have gone through atrocities like that. And somehow they said, well, everyone around me died, but I'm still here. I didn't eat for days and days and days. Now, I don't know where they get that courage to really have pushed through, you know, but I agree with you that it becomes very hard. And I've had this question before. So very hard when you're struggling to be kind to someone. I understand that. It's really hard if you're hungry to feel optimistic that you're going to eat at some point. I don't know how to. I don't want to use the word counsel because again, I'm not a therapist or a clinical anything, but I just am inspired by some of the stories that I've heard, some atrocities that we've heard in working with, again, tagging along, as they say, the ride-alongs with people who work with PTSD and these horrific stories that you hear that people have suffered, refugees. We've worked with asylum seekers. It's hard, but somehow some people are able to harness something within themselves to get through, even small things. I'm sorry if that's not a satisfactory answer, but it always shocks me when I encounter some of these survivors. They just say, well, I had to hold on to something because I knew it eventually something would yeah, that's I'm sorry if I can't it's really hard. It's really hard. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You said that sorry.
Sorry to see. Sorry. No, because someone else is in the, I'm sorry.
You
Yes,
said
yes.
that the aging process is not linear, right?
For telomere attrition is not linear. It's up to the age of 20 is linear.
Yeah,
yeah.
So the aging process in a way is also not linear, the speed of aging, I guess. And I was asking myself if also the beneficial effect of the action you just said are different depending on the age you start doing it, or, I mean,
Yeah.
we still have hope even if we're over 50s?
So there are, again, this is not that kind of talk, but there are genetic disorders with genes that regulate telomere length. Okay, dyskeratosis congenita, for example, where babies are born with defects in the genes that maintain telomere length. And yes, they die at 3, 4, 5 years old. I'm part of a project right now at the Dana-Farber where they have set up an entire wing on telomere biology diseases. And what they're doing now is trying to understand these mutations and these kind of ways in which they can intervene, because that's an extreme, right? They're dying because their whole mechanism is not working, right? The kind of telomere shortening I'm talking about is within normal working genes for telomere length, right? Within normal parameters. So unless you have one of these very rare disorders is where I'm going, right? You have the ability to have, the telomere length is not in a disease phenotype, okay? Because these children have, there's a whole slew of telomere biology diseases. That's not what I'm talking about, because those are mostly Mendelian diseases. What I'm talking about is if you are just within the normal non-disease category of telomere length. And yes, this is going to be a bit provocative, and also I have 3 papers on this, but in utero exposure, the mom with the baby and all that, because it's epigenetic, unfortunately, the environment that the newborn is born into can already been impacted while they were in utero. So I have a lecture series, I call it, because so many people, aging starts in utero. And the reason I say that is because the health of the mom, the health of the environment already puts the child, the infant, at a disadvantage if the mother is a smoker or a drinker or morbidly obese, or they live in an area that is as the infant is born, it's already telomeres already impacted, because telomerase, which maintains telomere length, which means every time you lose some, you gain some every time. That's what's happening in the stem cells. That's why the stem cells when they come out, they're fully, as if it's a new day, right? But you don't have telomerase in somatic cells after 15 weeks in gestation, right? It's turned off. So the infant is susceptible as well to any outside exposures. So, and again, depending on the environment, and meaning the in utero environment, the child is born with already a disadvantage if it's been in a disadvantaged environment, or not, preserved, right? So the reason it's linear, it's because it's dependent on DNA replication. So people hear DNA, I don't want to go so DNA replication happens on two strands, 5' to 3', 3' to 5'. So what happens is, because of the way the DNA machinery works, if it's on the continuous strand, you get copy of the entire chromosome. If it's on the other strand, because of the 3' lagging problem, you always miss a piece of that part of the chromosome unless you have telomerase that fills it in, which is what you have in stem cells, because they're progenitor cells. They're the pluripotent cells that give rise to the other cells. So those reserves are fine, right? It's the problem is, in somatic cells, you don't have the telomerase mechanism after 15 weeks, because if you do, see, there's no free lunch. It puts you at risk for cancer, because what telomerase does is keep an unhealthy cell full of mutations alive. Telomerase is called the immortalizing enzyme because it keeps cells alive. That was the reason Elizabeth Blackburn and Carol Greeter and Jack Szostak won the Nobel Prize in 2007, was for the isolation of the machinery that maintains telomere length. Because we know about telomeres since the 1940s. But what is it that maintains and modulates? It's that. And so this telomere package is what maintains telomere length. So this is why when you're mostly in proliferation, which is the first 20 years of life, there's the most impact on your telomeres. Then after which, proliferation slows down, right? Because you're not growing as much. So then you have this plateauing. It's not linear. It's linear, and then it sort of plateaus out. So the difference is the deltas becomes less and less. So if you are studying children and you're looking at the impact of some carcinogen or some PM particulate matter, and then they ask me for my advice, I said, well, if we have a very young group, like the Romanian orphans, we didn't need a lot because the impact was so dramatic. We were able to see differences immediately. That was then supported by scan data and other data, right? So it's the way our science works is it's sort of like a case in the court, the preponderance of evidence. You put it all together. So that's the reason. It's because of the cellular processes that work. Sorry if I went too long on that, but makes sense now. Yeah, it's hard to give a talk like this because you don't want to shortchange who wants to know more of the science, but yet it's so boring for those people who don't really need to know about the telomerase. But I'm happy to talk about that too. Oh, one more. I'm sorry, in the back?
Yes, just one thing. We are going for the two last question in person, and then there are other questions from the people who are connected remotely.
Yes.
So just to reassure the one connected that we are going to go through them.
Sure. Yes.
I'm going through miscarriage, and I was, you say that the body doesn't know why you are stressing. I was wondering if there is biologically a time when you have to force yourself to have courage, also if you don't don't know where to take, or don't have the force, the power to be courage, and then to start all the things you say to feel better.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you had to go through that. I cannot counsel. I don't have that kind of expertise. But I would hope that you could have some support or talk to someone. Yeah, even in the darkest hour. I mean, this is not cliche, but again, my experiences from talking to Holocaust survivors and also people who have been in those Romanian institutions. There are ways in which you can harness that courage, but it's individual. I don't know what would bring someone out to gain courage versus another. Uh, I could go from my own personal experience, but it's very different from anyone else's personal experience. The little things that give you hope, that give you the courage to see tomorrow, to see later, to enjoy, I don't know, a meal or a walk with a friend or with a family member. It's hard for me to counsel on that. I'm sorry that it happened.
Here,
The last one?
me probably.
Oh, yes.
Do you
I don't
have
know.
another one?
Martina,
Just me,
you,
right?
okay.
So I just have a quick question, and thank you very much for sharing the knowledge. When I woke up this morning, I didn't know about telomeres and all the science behind, and it's very interesting to see from a different perspective. So my question or maybe comment is, how can we contribute to have teamwork with a normal standard telomeres shortening process in our daily activities?
You mean, how do you keep your telomeres healthy and not shortening?
And the people who is working with us.
Oh. You guys should be kind to each other, okay? No conflicts, please. Yeah, hopefully people have some knowledge of ways in which they can just better their day. And I want to go back to forgiveness, because forgiveness doesn't mean you in the chapter, there's a really interesting, and I don't want to take time because there's a really interesting story about how a family in South Carolina forgave this person who blew up the church that their children was in. And you would say, how can anybody forgive? And the one thing that they did in the courtroom, once this person was sentenced, was one mother said, I forgive you. It doesn't mean that this person doesn't go to jail, or that you've condoned forgiven, meaning forget. It means that I don't want to, I've already suffered. I lost my child. I don't want to suffer more by having this person living in my head all the time. So it's very important for her to go into that courtroom and say, I forgive you. Because when you do that, so where am I going with this in terms of keeping like a kind environment? So sometimes you have to just do that. In a workplace or in a situation where conflict comes up, you have to say to yourself, I'm not going to let this hurt me. I'm going to forgive this and let go of the grudge. Okay, so the online questions?
There was Yulia saying, thank you for, no, sorry, the first one was, there are a lot. So Jerusa was saying, it seems everything that preserves health and promotes healthy aging relies on having a good socio-economic status. I would like to know whether there is any relationship between telomeres length and economic status, poor, rich, or third world, first world population.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are papers, if you search on my name with SES, that's how we in the United States, social economic status, and your inclination is absolutely correct, that if you have low SES, your telomeres will be shorter. And so we've looked at populations in the United States. So again, the definition of low SES, I can only confine it to the way we have it in the US. We've not done any international studies, but poverty is absolutely correlated, associated with short telomeres. Yes.
Then Mirella was asking, do you think in the near future our government health plans might include this specific info on the matter? Or rather, are you and any of your colleagues having a dialogue with public administration about all of these prevention methods?
Yes, so that speaks to public policy. And so in the state of Massachusetts, I cannot speak for the other 49 states. We are in conversations. I'm a scientist, but the public policy people with whom we work, it doesn't mean I'm not, we have different areas of expertise, but we work with the public policy people who then inform our government. And so we have in the state of Massachusetts prevention programs, starting at childhood. We have programs for people of low socioeconomic status. They have free meals, healthy meals, free exposure to nature, that we do have that. But again, it's the United States is a very heterogeneous country, so it's not across the board, but I can tell you that we do have that. When you have meditation in the schools, just to give you an idea, yeah.
When you talk about the forgiveness, you said that it is easier to be angry and interpret as it is instinctive to have this reaction. From your lesson, we understood it's healthier to be forgiving. So my question is why our body mind is not evolutionary programmed to be forgiving? It's one of evolution aims to adapt to the environment, to let animals and so also humans to live longer.
Yeah, what's wrong with evolution? That's I get one of these questions sometimes that, yeah, wow, I got to think about that. I don't have a great answer, but maybe it's all related to free will and what people, the freedom of choice and what people want to do and not do. Maybe even though free will, some Sapolsky would say is really not free will. You're conditioned and shaped by your life experiences and context. Yeah, I'd have to think a little more about clearly there's an evolutionary advantage, but there's also an evolutionary advantage to having lots of resources available. And that's the whole aging theory that's out there, that eventually species die off. So you allow new species to come up because there's a limited resources of food, water, air, etc.
So Julia was saying, thank you for a great talk. You were talking about difference between acute and chronic stress. I think in a way some stress can bring some positive results, can motivate, like stress before exam motivates to learn, etc. Here we of course are talking about acute stress. Are there also some results on positive health consequences of some acute stress, or the goal should be rather to avoid any type of stress by any means?
No, absolutely not. There is good stress. There's also, you want to call it stress, but even the first love, the butterflies, that's the stress, the pathway. It's called the HPA axis, but colloquially we all call it the stress pathway. So there's some positive, absolutely positive, and running away from the predator is positive. That's a positive response. Yeah, but I know what you mean by that. Yes, there is some good stress that you need, that is healthy, emotion. It just doesn't have to be first love. It could be towards a child, towards an animal, towards a favorite food, towards a favorite activity. Stress in our society always has this kind of negative connotation, but the same sort of molecules and hormones are activated even when you have those positive feelings.
So last two questions. Mirella was saying, to my experience, humor has a therapeutic effect on brain and personal mood. Whenever you laugh, your brain goes for a very little moment on holiday. Whenever you laugh, while laughing, you forget all of your troubles. There are scientific studies about laughter, comedy, or what happens in your brain when it confronts with humor. So the effect is so short. What do you think about that? Could humor have individual and social benefits?
Well, I'm going to give you some inside secrets. When I go to bed at night, I watch 10 minutes of a comedy. Stand up, Chris Rock, I don't care who it is, it's got to make me laugh. So I don't have the scientific data in front of me because it's really hard, again, to measure, quantitate, right? You have to be able to quantitate this stuff. That's the only, doesn't mean it's not, we're limited by the limitation of what we can measure, or our technology can give us, right? But anecdotally, when you laugh, you do forget. There's sort of humor is, I'm talking about good humor, not bad humor. Good humor can be very satisfying in low stress. I do. Before I go to bed every night, I watch about 10 minutes. I don't care if it's the same comedy bit, as long as I'm laughing. It's okay.
Okay, last question. It often seems that kindness and integrity actions are not considered in evaluation for research career advancement, which is mainly based on publication metrics and competition, often provoking mental health problems, especially in the early career stages. What is your opinion or perception on this? Do you think a systemic change in researchers' evaluation should be introduced to make research environments really based more on integrity, ethics, collaboration, and inclusivity values?
Yeah, I can speak to that because I've seen this comes from the top. The PI of the lab is what I can speak to. So I've worked with many types of PIs, and yes, there's some PIs that encourage this fake Darwinian survival of the fittest, which is nothing to do with that, where they really cultivate competition. And I've seen PIs like myself and others that are actually quite successful without doing that. So I don't, in my view, and this is all opinion, I don't see any merit, especially now where everything is what? Teamwork in science. Everything is collaboration. Unfortunately, if you have a cancer diagnosis, the first thing if you get when you get to a cancer hospital like the Dana-Farber is a team of people to work with you. You get the oncologist, you get the social worker, you get the clinician, you get the radiologist. So there is no benefit for there to be competition. I run a consortium of endometrial cancer. I have about 40 studies. 40 we would not have papers, we would not have grants if we competed with each other. So the nature of science now, which is very, very group, very collaborative, you need multiple disciplines to get at the scientific question. It would not be advantageous to be competitive. It would be advantageous to be cooperative. And I think that's evolution. Early on the savannah, the tribes had to cooperate within themselves, right? If you didn't, you didn't survive. So I don't prescribe, whichever word you want to use, to a lab environment that cultivates competition, because that's also sort of like old school kind of thinking. Like, oh, you have Darwin is so misquoted. That's not what he was saying. It's the person who's more adaptable to change, because your DNA is always changing, as in part because of the environmental selection and all that. So it has nothing to do with being, aggressive and stuff like that. But it's a trope. It's something that has been over the millennia probably encouraged. Uh, so yeah, I could, without naming names, as they say, know a lot of PIs that had very successful careers, two very different uh, styles, a competitive style and a kind style. There's no advantage. I can't imagine the people that came out of those competitive labs had any goodwill towards their PIs, where I could stand up here and say that the people that I've trained, I'm still working with them and writing grants after 20, 30 years. So there's some goodwill that trumps, sorry. That's the English word for, the American word for is better. Okay, sorry. So goodwill, that's what you should go out of here with. Cultivate goodwill, because it's not only good for your mind, but it's good for your health. That's it.